We are heading into our fantasy football playoffs, so that means the gloves are already come off. We're ready for a fight. But I gotta tell you something. Some of our top defenses in fantasy football on the year collectively, they may be in serious trouble this week. There are a lot of top defenses with seriously tough matchups. But that's why you tune into this every week, because I go through top 12 defense rankings for Week 15 fantasy football right now. So like the video, subscribe to the channel to show your support. And let's get into our first tier here, and it's going to be led off by a defense that shouldn't usually be anywhere near the top 10, the Ravens defense. They're taking on the New York Giants this week. So obviously, without me even saying that, if you just look at the matchup, you understand why the Ravens are at the very least inside the top 5. Now, let me tell you something else. Let's just address the negative first, because with the Ravens defense, I've given them grief all year. They've been a horrendous fantasy football defense. Their best game this year, depending on your scoring format, was 11 points versus the Buffalo Bills, ironically, in week 4. That was that was back in the month of September, basically, when that was the last game that they put up that was any good in fantasy football. Ever since then, they've been very mediocre at very best because they're just not forcing many turnovers. But here's some strengths with the Ravens this week. Obviously, the matchup speaks for itself. I don't need to tell you that the Giants are a fantastic matchup. We may not even see Drew Lock. It might end up being Tommy Cutlets again this week. But here's the other thing that the Ravens do really well. This is a pressure point for their defense, is they get after the quarterback. They have 41 sacks on the year, which is a major number in the entire NFL right now. Especially those bottom tier defenses in fantasy football. That's the one thing that's been saving the Ravens bacon right here. So they're taking on probably the worst offensive line in the league. They will definitely get 5 sacks on whoever the quarterback is. And I do believe that they will end up with a turnover because the Giants have one of the worst turnover differentials in the entire league right now. So as far as I'm concerned, I think the Ravens are a combo of a very safe play with about a 15-point ceiling. That's the reason why they're here at number 1, because at number 2, we start to see some cracks. I've got the Broncos defense here at number 2 because they're taking on the Indianapolis Colts. Now, number 1, the Colts have one of the worst turnover differentials in the entire league. Actually, it's not that bad as far as their differential goes, but as far as giving the ball away, they're one of the worst at it. They have 20 plus turnovers this year because Anthony Richardson does not know how to play clean football. That's his brand of football. He's very reckless. He fumbles and he throws interceptions. So we will definitely get a combo of that because the Broncos defense is a very strong one in fantasy football. They also get after the quarterback, so they will force more mistakes, or they may end up sacking Anthony Richardson a couple times. Now, they may not end up with as many sacks as they usually do because A-Rich is very, very mobile, as we all know. But with the Broncos defense here, they're a top 2 defense this year because they're leading the NFL in sacks with 47 sacks, and their interceptions have actually been given an uptick specifically over the last month. So as far as I'm concerned, I still view the Broncos as a very safe play. Very similarly to with the Ravens here, as a decently high ceiling this week, taking on an offense that is just definitely turnover prone, but the potential for them to score points this week is not exactly out of the equation as being high. And then the Cardinals defense to round out this tier at number 3. Listen, the Cardinals defense against the Seahawks, they got owned. Like, there's no questions, no ifs, ands, or buts. The Seahawks owned the Arizona Cardinals this year. It's over. Obviously, they've played each other. The Cardinals defense ended up being a really good play the first time they played the Seattle Seahawks, and then they weren't as good the second time that they played the Seahawks. But essentially, what you've seen over the past month is really good performances from this fantasy football defense because they are a good defense. They're getting after your quarterback. They're getting a turnover at least per game. Actually, somewhere around 2 turnovers per game, basically the last 2 months. So this defense here, they're taking on an opponent that is coming out of a bye week. That's the only thing that maybe concerns me, and an offense that maybe sometimes can put up 20 plus points on you. But at the same time here, the Cardinals defense is getting turnovers, and Drake May is turning the ball over every single week. So I think the Cardinals defense is a good play in the top tier this week. Dropping down to our next tier right here, I've got the Commanders defense at number 4, and they're taking on the New Orleans Saints. So obviously by now, if you have not heard, you have no more Derek Carr. There's no more Derek Carr in this New Orleans offense. It is essentially going to be whatever they roll out, whether it's Jake Haener. I can't imagine they go back to Spencer Rattler here. I've seen Ben DiNucci's name floated around. Either way, that tells you their quarterback situation sucks, and they already have no playmakers on this offense outside of Alvin Kamara that actually is functional on a weekly basis. So just based on matchup here, they have to be inside the top 5. And then with the Commanders here, the one thing that puts them over certain defenses this week is that the Commanders have actually had some really good spike weeks in fantasy football. They played really well against the Carolina Panthers in week 7. They also played really well against the Cleveland Browns back in week 5. They've actually had good spike week performances while maintaining a relatively stable floor depending on your scoring format. And the reason they could do this is because they have 32 sacks this year, which is not a bad number, and they also are getting turnovers as well. So just with this New Orleans Saints offense, I don't see them putting up many points and probably sending over a couple turnovers the Washington Commanders' way. At number 5, I've got the Kansas City Chiefs defense here. They're taking on the Cleveland Browns. So what's my number 1 rule? For those of you who have been watching my defense rankings all year, you want to play a defense that is playing Jameis Winston. Jameis Winston, in many ways, is one of my favorite quarterbacks in the NFL right now because he provides tons of fantasy upside. He himself can hit fantasy games, but he also very consistently makes good defensive plays, whoever's playing the Cleveland Browns. Even if the Cleveland Browns can match the Chiefs in points this week, theoretically, and they both get into a 24-point game, I don't see a way where the Chiefs don't come up with 2 interceptions at the very least. That's the Chiefs' weakness this year has actually been turnovers. They're not getting many big plays. They're actually not getting after the quarterback very much. But Jameis Winston doesn't need pressure in his face to turn the ball over. He's always just played a reckless brand of football. And I just think that with this matchup here, it makes so much sense to have the Chiefs inside the top 5 because I believe this probably will be a lower scoring affair. And on top of that, I do believe that they come away with at least 2 interceptions in this game. Dropping down to number 6 to round up this tier, the Chargers defense are at number 6, and they're taking on the Tampa Bay Bucks. So obviously this is an offense that can score well over 20 points every single game. Now this is a situation here, I think, with the Buccaneers, which is that Baker Mayfield has definitely dropped off as far as his performances go over the last month or so, I would say. And listen, the reason I'm sure is probably tied to Chris Godwin and just, his inability to stay consistent as a player in general. The one thing that's actually relatively consistent with Baker is he does throw interceptions as well. He threw 2 to last week to the Las Vegas Raiders, Mike, for crying out loud. Like, that's pretty absurd. So I see this defense, a defense that is so, it's a lock every week. They drag their opponent down into low-scoring games, even if the offense is really lethal. So they're going to drag them down into a lower scoring game. And they'll also be able to create turnovers and get after Baker Mayfield because their pass rush has 39 sacks this year. I see the Chargers still being a really solid play this week. Dropping down to our next tier right here, I've got the Vikings defense at number 7, and they're taking on the Chicago Bears. Now listen, the Chicago Bears, their offense looked atrocious last week, and I thought they were going to get a bump with their interim coach now that Matt Eberflus was out of the building, and that did not happen for the Chicago Bears. Now the one problem that the Vikings have given us really in recent memory was last week against the Atlanta Falcons. They disappointed a lot of people in fantasy football this past week. Now with the Minnesota Vikings, if you actually looked at their defensive performance here, they still had two interceptions and 1 fumble recovered. So that's 3 turnovers still for this turnover-happy defense that has been like this all year. Now the weakness for the strength for the Bears offense has actually been they're not big on turnovers. They actually play a pretty clean brand of football here. But with the Bears offense, their offensive line will not be able to hold this pass rush. Caleb will get mauled probably, with 5 sacks this week. And I do just think that their ability to get a turnover in this game is pretty much a lock. So they're lower ranked this week because the Bears are not as reckless as other teams, but I still do think the Vikings are a solid play. And at number 8, I've got the Texans defense, and they're taking on the Miami Dolphins here. Now listen, Miami is not a good matchup. I'm not even going to try to act like it is. Miami with Tua, they're actually putting up points, they're putting up yards, and they're actually not turning the ball over a ton. This offense has become really well run now that Tua is back from his concussion. But the one thing with the Texans here is that's their strength. Their strength is taking the ball away from you. They're a defensive run culture by D'Amico Ryans. They have 16 interceptions this year and 7 fumbles recovered with 42 sacks. So The Dolphins' offensive line has been a problem this year. That's no secret. That's how Tua got. That's not how Tua got hurt in particular play, but Tua has been had issues as far as sacks go this year. So I just think the Texans defense is simply too strong, and they're coming out of a bye week. It's at home. I think the Texans are a really good play this week. Rounding this one out, I've got the Seahawks defense at number 9. They're taking on the Green Bay Packers. It is a Sunday night game. I think this is a really tough game for the Packers right here, and I'll tell you why. So the Packers do have an advantage as far as, coming off a long week since they played on Thursday night last week. But at the same time here, the Seahawks are running through teams right now. They look really good right now, and in particular, their defense in fantasy football has actually been freaking lights out over most of the last month. They've had 20-point games. They've had 15-point games. They've had 10-point games. Their defense has looked awesome, and some of them against really good opponents too, because their defense is getting after your quarterback, and they're getting at least 1 turnover per game. This defense is physical, man, and the one problem the Packers have had is interceptions with Jordan Love. He typically throws at least 1 interception per game. So in this matchup, I don't think this will be as high scoring as some people may think it is, and I do expect the Packers to turn the ball over at least once, hence why the Seahawks, in maybe a game where I wouldn't usually put them in the top 10 when a defense is facing the Packers in particular, I think the Seahawks have been playing too good at this point. And dropping down to our last tier, I feel very similar about the Pittsburgh Steelers defense as I was just saying with the Seahawks defense. Obviously, we know the Steelers defense has been elite this year in fantasy football. They're a top 3 defense right now in fantasy, and not just the past month, their entire year has been full of like 12-point games, 15-point games, nothing explosion like 20-point games or anything like that. My problem with the Steelers, though, is that if you look at their 2 toughest matchups this year, they played Baltimore and they played the Cincinnati Bengals. They had good weeks in as far as defense goes in fantasy football in both of those weeks. But those were by far their 2 toughest matchups. This is going to be their toughest out-of-division matchup. So I'm curious and I'm worried as far as how the Steelers will play the Eagles in Philadelphia this week. When the Eagles are rolling offensively, they're rolling more so defensively. That's what actually keeps the Steelers inside the top 10, is that their offense is showing cracks with A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, and Jalen Hurts discomfort with each other right now. That's what's keeping the Steelers inside the top 10, along with the fact that they've been a great defensive play in fantasy the entire year. And then the Rams defense is at number 11. They're taking on the 49ers in San Francisco on Thursday night. So listen, I expect this to be a dogfight in San Francisco on Thursday. They're both fighting for playoff chances right here. And listen, the Rams offense has obviously been playing fantastic. Well, the Rams defense, I've been kind of talking them up over the last month and a half or so. They've actually not been particularly great in fantasy football over the last month. Like, they've had some tougher opponents. They had to play Philly. They had to play Buffalo, obviously, just last week. But even against, like, New Orleans in Week 13, they had a really low-scoring game because they got 0 sacks. And they also got 0 sacks last week. So I'm wondering if that's becoming a problem. But just the way the 49ers are, functioning offensively right now, with another injury to another running back, and they will probably have to go with a backup running back yet again, I can't see a world where the Rams do not have some sort of success in fantasy, because I believe they will get a turnover or 2 in this game, because the 49ers are prone to that, and I don't know if the 49ers can put up 20 points in this game. Honestly, I don't really know if they can. And then rounding us all out, uncomfortable, but it makes sense. The Bengals defense, for many reasons, makes sense here. First of all, they take on the Tennessee Titans. This offense put up 6 points on the Jacksonville Jaguars just 1 week ago. It was abysmal. So their offense looks bad all over again. Will Levis, he's got a shoulder injury now. He may or may not even play this game. Honestly, it may not make a difference because Levis has actually been turning the ball over much less than he was at the beginning of the year. But the reason it ultimately makes sense here is because, a non-biased opinion here, the Bengals have actually done low-key okay in fantasy the last 2 games in particular off their bye week. They had an 8-point game against Pittsburgh, and they had an 8-point game against the Dallas Cowboys. In that time, they had 5 sacks in those 2 games, and they also got 3 turnovers in those 2 games. Now they're taking on an offense that will not score many points, will not generate much offense, depending on quarterback. So ultimately, the Bengals defense has been able to come up with the plays necessary for fantasy production over the last several weeks, and they're playing an offense that does give up those plays and cannot score as many points. And as I do at the end of every single defense video, I give you my favorite defense to pick up in advance for next week if you have the roster space to do it. And this particular week, this defense is going up against a really tough Sunday night matchup, so I think they will not be used and probably dropped if they are not already on waivers. And I've got the Packers defense for week 16. This defense is taking on the New Orleans Saints on Monday Night Football. They will be without Derek Carr, without obviously Chris Olave and a bunch of other playmakers that matter. They will be down to Alvin Kamara and hopefully Marquez Valdes-Scantling play for fantasy upside on his end. But for the Packers defense end, this should be a really good defense to play in fantasy football in week 16. So let me know how your lineup is starting to look this week, and if you want to see the top 30 wide receivers for this week, click on this video right here.